I'm Marshall Kozlov.
And I'm Mike Doran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance. This is an episode we've promised everyone for a couple weeks ever since you left town for a bit, Mike. You went to Central Asia, so this is a great opportunity for us to recount your trip, but learn a little more about a region that most people, by definition, don't have very much experience in. So let's start with you just giving an outlay of the region, the countries you visited, and what your general interest is.
Oh, thanks, Marshall. So it was a trip to Central Asia and the Caucasus. So basically Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan. We dropped in briefly in Ankara as well on the way. The focus of the trip was Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, which is quickly becoming one of my favorite countries in the world. And I'd like to discuss that with you, why it's one of my favorite countries. It's just an amazing place, Azerbaijan. But Uzbekistan was also just incredibly exciting. For me, I've been working in foreign policy, international affairs for all of my adult life, I guess, really. And the return to Central Asia, the first time I went to Central Asia for the first time in 1989. I was in Uzbekistan in 1989 when it was still part of the Soviet Union. But this is not a part of the world that I have focused on much at all. In the intervening, how many years is that? Like I said, 70 years between 1989 and now. The return to it for me I felt like being an undergraduate again. Just the world there has changed very significantly in very exciting ways that are interesting just in and of themselves, but I think they're also very strategically interesting. From their whole band of countries, if you go from China all the way across to the Mediterranean, there's a common theme running through that whole area of these countries kind of coming into their own in this multipolar world that we're in now, and each of them, each in its own way, is working to prevent itself from being under the thumb of China or Russia, and to develop links with each other and with the outside world that are independent of China and Russia, and it's really quite exciting.
That brings up an obvious question. You left out the United States when you said China and Russia. What is the U.S. relationship to the region?
Well, the U.S. is kind of oddly absent. There was a Central Asia strategy that was developed by the Trump administration, and there is an American awareness by a small group of experts on Central Asia. There's an awareness of these developments that are going on in the region and how potentially important they are for the United States. But I would say that by and large, people are like I was before I went to Uzbekistan right now. I mean, I'm more aware of the history of this part of the world, and I've been there before. So I work on the Middle East, which is an adjacent region, and I was only vaguely aware of what was going on there. So if for me it was a voyage of discovery, then I think for most foreign policy experts in the United States, let alone the average newspaper reader, there's really just not a lot of awareness, and that translates then into, I think, into our leadership. Our leadership is also not aware. I'd like to talk more about that when we talk about Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is the most strategically important country strategically valuable country to the United States that most Americans are not aware of.
Yeah, and then one last framing question before we get into that specific part. You made the reference to the increasing multipolarity in the world, but if we're looking at Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc., those are countries that are just in the backyard of Russia and China. So that's something that doesn't really, that was true in the 90s. That was true in the 2000s. That's less of a late 2010s phenomenon. So how do these countries, how do you think they conceive of themselves within the international system?
What they're doing is, as a friend of mine put it to me, he said they're shedding their Soviet skin. So one way to think about this, first of all, these are all of the countries of Central Asia. It actually depends on what you're talking about when you say Central Asia. But let's just say all the stands are Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. They are Turkic countries, and so is Azerbaijan. Now, the different dialects are not necessarily mutually intelligible, but a lot of them are, and they can all recognize each other as some related language. It's kind of, think about Italy and all of the dialects of Italy. You can say it's all Italian, but somebody from Rome can't understand the dialect of somebody from Sicily. That's what we're talking about with these countries in Central Asia, the stands. But they have been dominated during most of the last 2 centuries, or certainly since the Soviet Union. They've been dominated by Russia, and the Russians. The Soviet Union determined the borders between them, and worked to break up the kind of natural connections, cultural, economic, and otherwise, between them. So what's happening now is they are rediscovering their cultural and economic roots. They are learning different languages. I mean, the elite in all these countries still speaks Russian, but increasingly they are doing business in their national languages. And when in Uzbekistan, we went to, I was on the trip with Walter Russell Mead, Hudson's own Walter Russell Mead, and the global affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal. We visited a university in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and we learned there that the students are really interested in learning. There's a greater interest on the part of young people in learning English than learning Russian. There's also interest in learning Chinese as well. There's a huge trade with China, but the goal of all of these countries is to balance the influence of Russia and China with the influence of outside powers, including the United States. But they recognize, they're very savvy, all of them, about international politics. I mean, you can have an extremely sophisticated discussion about international politics with a taxi cab driver in these countries. Much more sophisticated discussion than you can often have in Washington, D.C., because it's so much a part of their daily life. And they're aware that the United States is kind of distracted. They're aware that the United States doesn't have a clear understanding of its own strategic interests at this point, and they're aware that the United States is pulling back. I mean, the big story dominating everything in that part of the world right now is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the debate is about what effect that's going to have on the wider on the wider region, and how is the United States going to how is it going to compensate for the rise in power of China that will inevitably result of China and Russia as a consequence of the U.S. Pullback. China, Russia, and Iran. Iran is another big player in that part of the world, of course.
Can you speak a bit to the relationship between Central Asian countries and China? So you spoke about Russia. What's the Chinese context?
Well, China is a lot of these countries, a number of them, particularly Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan to a lesser extent, are very rich in oil and gas. So Turkmenistan, it sells all of its almost all of its, historically has sold almost all of its gas to China. China gets it at a very preferential rate. And that brings me to my favorite country. Have I said that? Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. People should, as I'm talking, you might want to pull up a map and look at a map, because Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan are on opposite sides of the Caspian Sea. They're both oil rich. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there has been disagreement among all of the littoral states of the Caspian Sea about the energy resources of the Caspian. And Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan have recently gotten over their disagreement about a major gas field, and they have cut a deal. And as a result, Turkmenistan is going to export gas over to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is now an energy hub. It has its own independent resources, but it is delivering those resources through Georgia and Turkey to Europe. The southern gas corridor recently opened up, and that goes from Baku to Puglia in Italy, and helps supply Italy with gas. Now Turkmenistan is now part of that network, and that allows Turkmenistan then to have an outlet to the west that is not dominated by either Russia or China. And that's the kind of thing that's what's happening in all of these countries, especially with regard to the energy resources, is that they are looking for alternative supply routes or export routes that don't allow Russia or China to dominate them.
So we will, and you've been setting this up, so I promise we will get to the question of why Azerbaijan is your favorite country. But one last thing in this topic area, I really liked your articulation of you feeling like an undergraduate when you arrived in the region. What would your thesis be then? Let's pretend it's senior year.
Well, the thesis would be that there's a national reawakening going. For lack of a better word, I mean, the word nation is the word nation is fraught with difficulty, because again, the analogy with Italy, to what extent do the people of Milan feel like they are part of the same nation with people of Sicily? It's the same kind of regionalisms you have in a country like Uzbekistan. I had a guy, and we went to Samarkand and Bukhara, and I had a guy in Bukhara tell me he's not from the same country as somebody who's from Samarkand. They're not that far apart, but they're different oases, along the old Silk Road, and they have a lot of local culture. I don't know to what extent he was just being provocative and to what extent he actually felt it, but he clearly he felt it on some level. But there is in the let's say late medieval period, so like say around 1500, from 1200, even earlier, from 1000 to 1500, Samarkand and Bukhara are centers of global civilization. I mean, they are sparkling centers of civilization, certainly of Islamic civilization. Some great works of Islamic civilization come out of Samarkand and Bukhara. And since then, since the circumnavigation of the globe, which changed trade routes, the decline of Turkic power, the Turks, the Samarkand and Bukhara were glittering centers of global culture when the Turks were the strongest people. And when I say Turks, I mean like Turco-Mongols. At that time in history, the mounted archer was the most powerful military formation, and the greatest armies of mounted archers came out of Central Asia. So they dominated the whole Eurasian landmass. And the cultural centers of that power were Samarkand and Bukhara, among other places. So that since 1500, they've been in eclipse, and now they're coming back. These are, a lot of connections between in this part of the world that have been lost for centuries they're being rediscovered. So that's kind of exciting. So from a strategic point of view, from the point of view of the United States, let's put it this way: the United States is pulling back from this part of the world, but the United States remains in a global competition with China, and so. It does not want China to dominate these countries, especially because of their importance in the global energy trade. So strategically that's the theme. But just as far as being an undergraduate is concerned, these countries have been dominated by Russia and dominated by communism for a century, if not longer. And suddenly they are returning to history as independent actors, and they are rediscovering the connections between them. This is like, you would have thought that this would have happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, but it didn't, because a lot of the post-Soviet political structures in this part of the world were just sort of extensions of the Soviet Union, of the power structure of the Soviet Union, and that's all starting to change now.
Can you just explain that a little more? Give an example.
Oh, well, the greatest example is in Uzbekistan, because the leader of Uzbekistan after the fall of the Soviet Union, Karimov. This is a great example of what I'm talking about. Is Karimov he closed the borders of Uzbekistan to all the surrounding countries, so just think about it in terms of trade or even tourism. It was very difficult to go back and forth between Uzbekistan and its neighbors. When after Karimov left the scene about 5 years ago, and there was a change of regime, there's a completely new spirit in Uzbekistan, one of openness to the neighbors, facilitating trade with the neighbors, and privatization of the economy. They got a long way to go on that, but it's happening, and there's an entrepreneurial spirit among people, which is unmistakable. When you just walk on the street and you talk to people, you see it everywhere, and they talk to you about how excited they are. This is all very new. I mean, we met with a group of young entrepreneurs in Tashkent, and they were talking about it, and we asked them, what's the difference between now and 5 years and 5 years ago? And they said 5 years ago we couldn't even have this conversation with you.
Wow.
Because talking to foreigners about this kind of thing was suspect. And now there's a desire for foreign direct investment. There's a desire for tourism. There's an openness to the neighbors, which hasn't existed before. Now they have a long way to go in terms of creating a customs union or something like that. Uzbekistan is not part of the WTO. There's all kinds of challenges that stand in front of people, but they're talking about them openly, and there's a wholly new spirit there. Now, Uzbekistan is the most populous country of Central Asia, and it is also home to the greatest architectural monuments in Samarkand and Bukhara, especially Samarkand. I don't want to insult the people of Bukhara. I think that they think their architectural monuments are better than Samarkand, but the ones that really just blow your mind are in Samarkand. So Kazakhstan is the richest. It has the greatest natural resources, but Uzbekistan is the biggest, and Uzbekistan is at the center. It's the fact that it has now opened up is having a major impact on it's kind of a natural leader. I guess there's a little bit of a rivalry between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but the fact that Uzbekistan is opening up to the outside world is having an impact on all the rest of the region.
And just to clarify something, because it's a semi-interesting note, a lot of the post-Soviet states obviously had a high amount of Western invention, foreign investment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What explains Central Asia's isolation during that 15-20 year period, right? Because there are plenty of post-Soviet states, including Russia, that had plenty of foreign engagement. What explains the isolation? Because it's not simply that there was like a Russian political system there then.
to be honest with you, I can't play the great expert on all of this. I have impressions, which are really basically impressions from this trip, but I haven't been following it closely. I think it's just my feeling off the top of my head, or my impression is that it's just the resistance of the ruling elite in those countries. Who came to power under the Soviet, in the Soviet era, and they were resistant to privatization because it threatened them. I think I could be wrong, but they just entrenched, the entrenched interest. Now, a guy like if I had a better understanding of this. You remember I said that the Soviet Union drew all the borders between these countries. These are not, historically there's no such thing as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. I mean, historically these were they were not necessarily all part of the same thing, but there were different empires and different states that had parts of these countries, including also parts of Afghanistan and Iran, within their realm. And so as a result, the shared culture and shared history between them is very, very significant. And many of them can claim the same cultural icons. So if we could resurrect Mr. Karimov and ask him, why did you close all the borders? He probably has an argument to make. I'm making this up off the top of my head, but he probably has an argument to make and say, look, I had to help establish an Uzbeki national national culture or national system first before we could open to the outside world. Otherwise, we might just get, we could find ourselves disintegrating in this larger whole. And so that's, one of the, if I understood this part of the world better, I just know it from the Middle East. It's a similar kind of dynamic in the Middle East. If you look at Arab countries, they have the same sort of issues that, Arab leaders, unlike a lot of other parts of the world, can call over the heads of their fellow Arab leaders and talk to people in the street about what's going on in a way that, say, the president of the United States has trouble calling over the head of a Canadian leader to people in Canada and can't bring people in Toronto out in protests. So that's got to be a concern. But I'm saying it purely theoretically, not that I really understand what's happened there. But also they're in a very, still answering your question about how come this awakening or opening to the outside world is coming relatively late, given that the Soviet Union hasn't been with us for some time. They're in a very difficult part of the world. I mean, it's not easy to border Russia, Iran, and China. Those are not the neighbors that I would choose for a happy life.
Yeah, and I'll let you finally get to the most important part of the conversation. Why is Azerbaijan your favorite of all the countries we're discussing today?
Azerbaijan, let me just start, instead of saying why it's one of my favorite countries, just to explain a couple of the things that make it unique and intriguing. One is it is the only country in the world that borders both Russia and Iran directly. So that already, given U.S. interests in I believe that the United States has a strong overriding strategic interest in containing both of those countries, and Azerbaijan is bordering both of them, and it is seeking to develop autonomy, independence from the two of them. Now, historically, as like the rest of the Central Asian countries, historically Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union. So that's one thing. Another thing, now I come at this as a Middle East person, right? And you go to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a majority Shiite country. So we have a majority Shiite country bordering Iran, but it is totally secular. Their political system is secular. Girls are not allowed to cover themselves in school, for example. And the minute you go there, you realize immediately that Azerbaijan is really part of the Europe. I mean, its ties to Europe are deep, and deep and abiding. And that's partly because Azerbaijan has been part of the Russian Empire since the 1820s. So a very long time. But also Baku was a leader in the global oil trade in the 19th century. It was one of the leading centers when oil first began to power modern economies. So it's been tied to the modern industrial economy from the beginning. Oil from Baku fueled World War II because it fueled the Soviet army against the Nazis. Azerbaijan is part of the Caucasus, which in the Caucasus it has a long history of ties to Europe. So that's very interesting. Azerbaijan is an ally simultaneously of Turkey and Israel. It had this war with Armenia last year. I was there for the war, by the way. That was my first trip to Azerbaijan, and it won the war with the support of Turkey and Israel. And we all know that Turkey and Israel are don't have the best of relations these days. And so it's just this country. It plays with all, and I would say this about all of Central Asia. Whatever, if you have these basic categories in your idea, in your head of who's against who and who belongs in what part of what region of the world, Azerbaijan messes with all of your categories. You kind of have to realize that when you arrive there, that the deck has been totally reshuffled, and everything you think about Islam, the West, the configuration of states in the Middle East and everything, you see it all very differently if you look at the world from Baku.
I'll ask the obvious follow-up, Mike. What were you doing in Azerbaijan during the war?
Well, a couple of things. One, on a personal level, I was escaping from American politics. It coincided with the election, and I was so sick of hearing about Trump, anti-Trump. I wanted to, fill my head with something else. So I went to Azerbaijan instead. But no, Azerbaijan is the most strategically influential country that you've never heard of. I mean, I explained to you just a second ago, sort of like just on the basis of the map, why it's important. But there's another aspect. It reminds me of Israel a lot, Azerbaijan, in that it has influence way beyond its size. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Iran. Now, the northwest quadrant of Iran, the capital of which is Tabriz, of that part of Iran, is ethnically Azerbaijani. So the ethnic Azerbaijanis in Iran represent somewhere between, somewhere between 25% and a third of the entire population of Iran. This is not a well-known fact. The Iranian political system under the Islamic Republic is dominated by the Persian ethnic group. The second largest group in the country are the Azerbaijanis. The rulers of Iran do not want you to recognize that fact. We don't know exactly if it's 20%, 25, 33. There's a different arguments about this, but it's an extremely large percentage, and it is all located right there in the northwest quadrant. And there's a cultural awakening going on among those people. I don't know that they necessarily want to secede from Iran. Their connection to Iran is long and deep, but there is a sense there that they are being treated as second-class citizens by the Persian majority, and that they want greater sort of cultural rights and so on. And they have tremendous feelings of affinity to the country of Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan has enormous reach and influence into Iran. Secondly, it has reach and influence into Russia. There are 2 or 3 million Azerbaijanis in Russia, and then you have all the other Turkic peoples of Russia who sympathize with Azerbaijan. Thirdly, They have enormous influence over Turkey. The Turks regard Turkey popularly regard the Azerbaijanis as a sister country, or even sort of as an extension of Turkey. Although the Turks are Sunnis and the Azerbaijanis are Shiites, so there's a kind of Turkish national spirit. And Azerbaijan has a huge influence in Turkey and in pulling Turkey toward its nationalist identity and pulling it geographically to the east. So there's that component of Azerbaijan's influence, and then there's this other thing that they are the leader, President Aliyev, and the elite in Azerbaijan are profoundly strategic. You can't be a little country that borders Russia and Iran and survive unless you are extremely clever. And you think strategically. So one of the things, I mentioned to you when we first started talking about this connection between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan across the Caspian Sea and helping Turkmenistan to export its gas to Europe. The Azerbaijanis are at the center of the effort to break down the barriers. I'm talking about particularly the economic barriers, the connectivity between the Turkic countries of Central Asia, and to help them to trade with the West. If there's a leader, I told you the leading country of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, only opened its borders with its neighbors 5 years ago. If there's a country that has been leading this effort to break down the barriers and to open up alternative lines of communication, transport, trade, IT, and so on, it's Azerbaijan.
Mike, I think that's an excellent place to leave it. As you mentioned at the start, you're just completing your undergraduate term visiting the region, but I think it's pretty clear this is going to be of incredible strategic value to the U.S. The conversation about the region is going to be incredibly important, so I easily see us revisiting us all soon on this topic. It's weirdly flipped. I'm interviewing you on a podcast we co-host, but it was really great speaking with you.
Well, Marshall, thank you for having me, and I hope to come back sometime.
Yeah, the booking was actually pretty difficult on this one, so hopefully the powers that be continue to approve this. And by the powers that be, I mean our producer, Phil Hegseth, who does a really great job. And speaking of really great jobs, I just want to say a huge thank you to Hudson Institute for supporting the work of Counterbalance. You can, of course, go to hudson.org to learn more about Counterbalance, Mike's work, and the broader research and focus of the Hudson Institute. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you all next week.